Hello and welcome to week 4 of group and organisational communication. In this week, we're going to go back to looking at the theories that help us understand the way an organisation is structured and thinking happens within an organisation in order to produce organising. And we will also be considering the impact of organising on communication and how communication itself as a constitutive model actually impacts organising as a process. Now let's take a step back and remind ourselves the kinds of things we were talking about when thinking of classical theory. The classical theory, through the three theorists that we looked at, Fayol, Weber and Taylor, were largely focused on the way organisations were mechanised in terms of the structure. That means the individuals had roles that were standardised, they were very specific. Individuals were thought of as cogs of a larger kind of machinery, and of course we had that machine metaphor to work with to remind ourselves the way the individuals in an organisation were actually functioning. In terms of communication and what was thought of in terms of communication processes through those models, when we talk about classical organisations, we didn't really have a considerable degree of communication theory in those three theorists. There was just the idea of the hierarchy of the organisation, the Scala chain, the vertical communication, and we had, of course, this idea of power emerging from a central authority and an organising authority within the organisation. So, of course, then, using those models, we had the prioritisation of the needs of the organisation over individuals, and the maintenance related communication, that is the communication that dealt with social relations, really dealt with maintaining the kind of power structures within organisation. So we can think, for example, of a concept such as respect for a boss, and using classical theory, the respect would have been subjugated under task-related communication. In other words, respect comes about not because of the relationship built up through communication, but because of the rules themselves that establish who is in control and who is a subordinate. This, of course, happens every day. When a fireman, for example, gives you instructions to jump from a burning building, we are following the rules of the task that are set before us to jump. It's not based on the fireman's authority in terms of your respect for him as a known individual. It is simply that it's task oriented and in a position of authority, not a known individual to you, but just in a position of authority, you follow the rules. So the classical theories emerged at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and what we're going to be looking at today are theorists from the 1920s onwards, and at that point the theorists started to focus on the value of individuals. And so on this slide you'll see the individual employee and his or her contribution as a central idea, providing us with two branches of theory, one called human relations theory, which looks at the emotional needs and the ideas of an employee feeling valued, and then the human resources, the ideas that they bring, the innovation and the knowledge. And of course, with these theories emerge ideas of non-financial rewards in the workplace, and so bring us up to the current day thinking about the other reasons people wish to work and the benefits of being in organisation, particularly when thinking about business organisations. For much of this lecture today, I'm going to be using the Catherine Miller text, and therefore we're kind of encouraged, if you like, to focus again about business and organisation from that perspective, but hopefully we can bring in other kinds of organising to include a broader perspective which is relevant for this course. Now, I found this slightly scary picture of what I think is a teddy bear's picnic, and it's really to give you this idea of the metaphor of family being the one that the human relations and human resources theory leans on when thinking about the way organising works in these theories. So while classical theory had this overarching metaphor of a machine in thinking about organisation, we now can start to think about the individuals connected through this kind of family relationship, this familial relationship. So the human relations theory has this particular dynamic, and if you think about the individuals in a family, maybe a parent and children and siblings, you can start to imagine the ways in which organising happens within that particular unit. So there are still leaders, or in an organisational, from an organisational perspective, managers or supervisors, who might be the parents, say, and they would assign tasks and maybe would assign tasks to the children. But what motivates the task being done and the task assignment is more than just pocket money and getting the job done. A parent presumably wants a child to clean their bedroom because it's useful for the health of everyone, and the management of the space. It's part of their learning, and it's deemed to be a good thing. And we can draw a parallel with organisations that are maybe labelled as ethical business, for example, and think about the fact that people in those organisations are working and part of the organisation for more than just the money. In other kinds of organisations too, particularly when you think about things like environmental organisations, people join charities and organisation for more than just the financial reward. Of course, people want remuneration too, and in some ways it's for many people it's what sustains them, but there are other things to think about, bigger things to think about, and in that respect the family metaphor is a useful one when thinking about why people come together and how they're connected. So here's our first slide that relates to content and theoretical orientation that would be considered part of the human relations theory or human relations approach. So that's going down the left arrow of the split where we initially showed that today we're talking about human relations and human resources. And human relations is about emotional need and feeling valued. So the employee's emotional state within a company, an organisation. So this slide I actually want to use for a number of purposes. One is to start us talking about something that Catherine Miller refers to, which are the Hawthorne studies. And these were analyses that were conducted, as you can see, in the 20s and 30s in the electric company in Hawthorne, Illinois, and they were conducted by Elton Mayo, who was a Harvard researcher. Actually, there were two researchers. There was one before him, but it's not especially important. And there are three particular studies or research pieces that I want to focus on within the Hawthorne studies. There were more than the three that are here, but these are the ones that I want us to spend some time thinking about. So one of the things I wanted to touch on first is the fact that she says at the end of talking about these studies that they were actually found in reanalyses to not hold what's called, scientific muster or rigor, meaning that when they were reanalyzed in the 60s and 70s by various people, either things had changed at that point or understanding had changed, and therefore it was felt that the conclusions that Mayo and his team drew were not actually as strong as they should be. So let me just read from the text in which he says, the reanalyses suggest that more traditional explanations such as incentives, pressures from management and worker selection are better explanations for the Hawthorne findings. So she describes them as being questionable, but certainly important, because at the time this is where the thinking was. And she does note that the Hawthorne investigations served as a springboard, moving organisational theorists from classical theory to human relations approaches. Now, the reason I wanted to start with that is to say what we're hearing about is only the initial idea, and therefore part of an understanding of what it means to feel valued within a company, and may even not be exactly correct on further investigation. But I want to say something else, and that is that part of this course involves a small piece of research that you're going to do in small groups, and therefore it's important to understand the nature of theory, and that theory, as I've said before, is an explanation given the evidence that you have, and it's thought to be a reasonable explanation, as I mentioned in the Van Ruler paper that we spoke about at the beginning. It's always going to be a partial explanation, and she's quoting from Littlejohn because Littlejohn says that theory is as a metaphor for reality. And as you will have discovered through reading research papers on various organisational structure, for example, or communication approaches and models for your query assignments, the deductive research builds on a theory in the same way that Barron built on Yanis. And as I've said before, and I'll say it again, theory is not static, and therefore we shouldn't be, trapped into thinking that an idea isn't augmented or moved along by further study. So just to draw an everyday example and a current example for us, when people were asked to wear masks to go out into the public, some people didn't do it and aren't doing it, and they're doing it in different ways. They're putting the mask below their nose, or they're keeping it on their chin, or they're not wearing it and just putting it on when they see people. There are all kinds of ways in which people behave, and I'm not questioning that. What I'm actually going to talk about is why that comes about. Now, part of the reason we might think is comprehension are the bits of information that are given, understood, and I want to say that if we are talking about the comprehension component, which is, do they literally understand the words or the rules, then when they don't, it's not about intelligence, it's really about perception. And there are so many layers to the way people perceive information and perceive texts, for example, which is relevant to us as communication scholars. When the rules are given, I've written down a few questions. Do I understand the words themselves? So that's part of the comprehension part, and you might want to link it to intelligence. But another part is the information truthful? Is it important to me? will I recall it when I need to, and can I do it? Meaning, can I afford to do it? Does it suit my health situations and all of those other things? So all of this is to say that the analysis of a situation and building the theory is going to change over time, potentially going to change with the breadth of your understanding of a situation, and going to change with the quality of the information that you capture. And part of the quality of that information is dependent on how you structure your tests. So let's just look at what the Hawthorne studies actually showed. So again, I'm going to read from the Catherine Miller text because she says it perfectly well, and there's no need for me to rewrite some of this stuff. So the illumination studies were actually conducted before Mayo entered the research team, and essentially they were designed to test whether some workers in a room, whether their productivity changed by affecting the lighting. So when it was brightly lit or when the area was dimmed. What is your assumption as to what might happen in a brightly lit area or in a dimly lit area? How is productivity affected? Well, you might think, from what we see in many everyday environments today, that a brightly lit environment was found to increase productivity. I think that's why you get environments that are harshly lit, like shopping environments, maybe, um, hospital environments as well. I think there are other reasons why the lighting, is the level that it's at. But sometimes it's thought that it impacts the behaviour and therefore will, certainly in this business situation, impact productivity. In fact, it was found to have negligible effect, no significant difference. In fact, when the workers were labouring in near darkness, productivity tended to go up in those conditions. So that was counterintuitive. It was thought that lighting and brighter lighting would have a positive effect, and actually it didn't. The interview program was actually conducted because of another test that was done, and it was the results weren't what people expected. So in the interview program, there were a number of people who were interviewed about the impact of working conditions on productivity. And it says here in the text that the interviewers found workers more interested in talking about their feelings and attitudes. They were interested in talking about their emotions rather than the objective difficulties of the situation. And we all know from being in working environments that how we feel about work, how we feel about the environment and the collegiality of the environment, meaning how comfortable are we with colleagues, can and does have an impact on how we work and whether we enjoy the experience. So people were interested in talking about those things. And the last experiment that I've listed under these Hawthorne studies is the bank wiring room study. And that was actually a series of investigations. And it was with men who were in the bank wiring room, and it was shown that they actually developed certain norms regarding the level of productivity, and the exerted social pressure on each other helped maintain a certain kind of level, i.e. we're not doing enough, or we should kind of speed up and that kind of thing. So there were a whole series of organisational findings that were discovered under these studies, under the auspices of these studies. And I think it's an important point to note that actually they didn't provide all the answers on reanalysis. We discovered that actually some of the findings weren't true or weren't correct for the new analyses. However, at the time, they really did help move researchers on from thinking about the classical organisation structures. Now, this slide shows some details about a particular study called the Relay Assembly Test Room studies, and it involved again a series of tests. This one was with a group of women who worked in a telephone exchange area. So they're the women who at that time would have pulled out the plug from a to link particular phone calls on a relay phone system. And productivity was tested against incentives and temperatures. Now, one thing to say is that these kind of social experiments conducted in the 20s and 30s, they might not be allowed today, but, certainly interfering with people's kind of peace of mind or state of mind by flicking on the lights or dimming the lights over time and testing them almost like they're kind of lab rats, has really moved out of fashion for obvious reasons, but nonetheless, this is what happened. So I'm presuming that the women weren't informed that this is what was happening in their physical environment. It would have just been done, and researchers on the outsides of the rooms dimming the lights and changing the temperature would have been seeing how productivity was being affected. So this happened over 12 months, and the conclusion is on the screen that when they were interviewed, social satisfaction from human association in work was more important as a determinant of work behaviour, i.e. their output, than any of the physical or economic aspects of the situation. Now, two things we can say about that. One is we know that to not be the complete answer, as Catherine Miller says at the end of the chapter, kind of incentives, including money, are sometimes more motivating than the satisfactory environment or the emotionally comforting environment. However, I think there are so many different ways in which different circumstances, different kinds of organisation, where actually money is not the main driving factor. As I've already said, people who work in, charities, for example, people who choose to work in all kinds of environments for the needs of children, maybe even in universities, researchers are, in part working to expand knowledge and study situations in order to help provide solutions. Were the employees of Google, for example, or Facebook, when Facebook first came about, motivated by the money they would make from it? Maybe, but I also suspect they were, absolutely thrilled and excited about the idea of linking people through Facebook, and therefore were kind of motivated to see what this could do and what social change it could bring. So, the idea about whether incentive is the most important thing or, an emotionally comfortable employee is the most important thing in terms of productivity, excuse me, I don't think that's an easy thing to talk about because there are so many variables. But nonetheless, this was the finding. It wasn't, by the way, thought that money had no impact on productivity. It just thought it had a lesser impact on productivity. So, that's something to bear in mind. We can also talk about something that was discussed and labelled as the Hawthorne effect, which is that mere attention to individuals by managers, for example, causes positive changes in behaviour. Now, I could see how this would be thought to be true and is important when you are in an environment and someone who gives you an assignment, indicates that it's a job well done. That can be positive. Obviously, if it's associated with some other kind of incentive, maybe the idea of promotion, maybe a bonus, maybe that's also important. But nonetheless, the Hawthorne effect deals with the positive impact from attention by an individual in the workplace environment. And so we can use that as a learning from these particular studies as Catherine Miller indicates, almost to discuss whether it still applies or the degree to which it applies in a certain environment. We could start to use our investigations into organisation in that way by looking at how it works and whether it's of similar impact as it was in this particular finding. Now, I've included this slide because I wanted to add a little bit of detail to two of the particular studies, the interview program and the bank wiring room studies. As the slide shows, the interview program really found that workers' attitudes were emotionally based, and that affected their interaction with management and interaction with each other. This program actually had the researchers, Mayo and his team, interview thousands of employees. That's a significant amount of data. And it was found that many of the worker management problems were actually due to emotionally based attitudes of the workers, not the objective difficulty of the task. That, of course, doesn't mean management didn't bring problems to the table, but we're talking about the majority of all the findings based on the majority where the data is concerned. So the outcome of that particular study was that people needed to feel they were valued. Money wasn't the overriding factor. In the bank wiring room studies, this was an observational study, so the researchers were just kind of watching and interacting, not interacting, but a kind of ethnographic study. They were seeing what was going on in the bank wiring room, and it was found that a standard was established among the men, which in fact meant that the more productive men were slowed down and the less productive were pressured to speed up in some ways, like the systematic soldiering that we saw in the classical theories, where production was kept down, in fact, in order to maintain wages. In this case, we had the similar kind of finding without the suggestion that people were artificially keeping their work levels down, their efficiency down. So we have this idea of social norms being exerted among staff to achieve certain levels. Now, I want to be clear here about what we're saying when we assert that the Hawthorne studies didn't hold scientific muster, meaning that when they were reset up in the 60s and 70s, or similar studies were set up, things weren't as they seemed in the Hawthorne studies. What it means is that when these studies were redone and similar studies were done, causation wasn't proven to the degree that the Hawthorne studies could be sure they were making these claims. That, or the data itself, led to a different conclusion altogether. Now, there's this situation that you get, and I think a parallel might be in a court case where someone gets off on a technicality. It isn't that he or she is not guilty, or it isn't that the issue hasn't been sufficiently proven. Sometimes it's that there was a technical problem and therefore the evidence can't be submitted, and therefore it can't reasonably be included to justify a particular issue. So I think we should take from this that the details of the Hawthorne studies were actually broadly correct, even though we're saying that the results were different when redone. What we're saying is people do need to feel valued. I think we all know that from our own personal experiences, and social norms are created in work environments. There are very different environments or very diverse environments that we can think about. I have worked in newsrooms, for example, where, in a small team, as a small group of journalists and editors, we've really inspired each other to put the magazine to bed on time, and it's because as a small team, we're all responsible for filling certain pages. You have to have a story, it has to be strong enough, it has to be written and edited and ready to go. You can't have a hole on a page, obviously, so you have to find a way to fill it. And if you're a small team and everyone kind of works well in a given month, let's say, and it was a monthly magazine I was working on, we managed to get it done. When things started to become problematic in the magazine, when we had issues with management not being sure about, the direction they wanted the title to go in, things actually started to fall apart. I want to give you another example of a piece of research that I've been working on. I've actually been looking at the factors that define online professionalism for healthcare professionals, particularly doctors and medical students. Now, I've written this paper, I sent it out to a journal, and it came back rejected, meaning it's not being published, with some comments that it felt like the issues hadn't been proven. So that doesn't mean, if I choose not to publish this paper, it doesn't mean that it's not correct. It means, according to this group of academics who are peer reviewing the work, they feel like the arguments aren't tied up properly. And so what I've been doing essentially is looking at what constitutes professionalism when medical students comment online through social media about things, about medical things and non-medical things. And does it constitute being unprofessional, and will it haunt them when they come to qualify and are doctors working in a field? And I'm arguing that actually the ethical standards required of medical students are different to other students in other areas of work, because they are supposed to be thinking about their ultimate end goal, which is to be a clinical professional, when yet they're still students. And that's one of the arguments. And I've drawn on information from various medical institutional bodies like the British Medical Association and such like, and used their wording and analysed it and compared it with other medical bodies to look at how things are varying around the world. And, online professionalism is emergent as an area of concern and an area of interest, because it's only now that, we're getting a lot more talk and discussion around social media and professionalism. All of this is to say, when you consider critiquing research, you have to seek to identify what it is that you're actually questioning. I mean, you don't necessarily want to rubbish the insights that you can gain from it simply by saying it, it's not true, when it may not be true on a certain basis or for a certain reason in that moment in time. And I think that's a really important point to make, because you will be analysing research for your queries and other assignments, and it's important for you to start to think critically about what you're reading. So we just have two more slides on the Hawthorne studies, and then we're moving on. And this one is something of a recap to say what we can say then about what the Hawthorne studies claimed in the 20s and 30s America, which is where they were done. So these are the three key findings. The explanation of needs of workers revolved around the social and emotional needs of them, of employees. That was one of the findings, that output in environments increased with informal social factors, i.e. workers together formed their own kind of norms and rules and behaviours. They slipped into certain kind of patterns and ways of being productive or not. Management styles of open communication between managers and staff were and are a positive thing. These were the findings. So the feeling of being valued and management contact, we can say, is the Hawthorne effect. The idea that if a manager shows you interest and shows interest in your work and perhaps indicates a positive endorsement in some way, whatever that might be, that is going to have a positive impact. The informal social factors, actually, there are parallels with the classical management theory. In maintenance-related tasks, according to classical management, i.e. friendships, those things were deemed to be important, or a certain kind of relationship that was important in organising. And then we have things that people care about, like personally driven projects. And we can think of current day examples, things like people organising curry queues in work, for example, or barbecues, where people come together and, you might not want to buy a lunch from somebody on a given day, but you do it to support them. Or maybe you feel slightly embarrassed not to support them. I'm not entirely sure what all of the possible reasons might be. I mean, I haven't thought them through, but just to say that sometimes you are motivated to support somebody. I mean, I've done this. I've seen somebody and, given them a sale, even though I haven't massively wanted the item, more because I want to support them in some way, for whatever reason. You find that in environments, you might gel well with someone who comes from a similar background. And that's also something you could say is kind of personally driven and is maintenance related. It's more about the relationships. You get on well with people maybe who are quite different and diverse from you because there's something kindred, and it connects you. So that's important. And generally you can talk about colleagues supporting each other, and you could imagine why that would be of benefit. Now, in the relay experiment that we spoke about, where the women were separated, they formed a tight-knit bond, and we already have the ideas of the tight-knit group from classical management, where people are isolated and form these kind of units. We also came across it in groupthink, where you have units of people that work together and don't take in expert opinion from outside, and it can shape the way they work. So we can think about positives and negatives, in fact, of the tight-knit groups. And small groups within organisations, as we know, can develop their own ways of being, including being toxic on one side of the scale, to being highly productive and working really well as a unit. And we know of examples of those. In the relay assembly test room, we saw the benefit of management's open communication in improving workers' feelings of whether they were being productive or useful in an organisation. So as I said, the subsequent analyses suggested that some of the traditional explanations were actually better in some cases than the findings of the Hawthorne studies. So things like incentives, whether it be money or promotion, management pressure, meaning top-down directives and deadlines, were useful, and worker selection, the processes of human resources actually selecting people who are fit for the job. All of these were better indicators of whether you were going to get a more productive team or not. So then the biggest benefit, perhaps we can say, from the Hawthorne findings from 30s America was the finding that the informal organisation within an organisation is proven to exist and have some kind of merit. So I'm just reiterating that last point here about the informal organisation within organisation, and I've spelled organisation with a Z here because that's how the quote is rendered. And it's from Pugh and Hickson, who made this point in 1989. And they say that the sociological value should not be underestimated. The idea of small groups actually strengthening organising and operating, and therefore impacting communication and determining communication in certain ways. And I've got two examples on the screen. Interestingly, both of them revolving around current technology, but I think separately we can say it's not just about the technology. But of course, the image on the right showing the social media connection or connectivity is just one of the ways we can think about groups forming informally, and that's a very relevant point to make at this point. Okay, so now we're moving on to Maslow's theory of hierarchy of needs, and I suspect this is something you may have come across in other places. Certainly, it's something that is taught across different kinds of discipline because it was created and kind of gained purchase both in areas of psychology and sociology, and of course Maslow himself and others have applied it to organisational theory and organising. So here we have this pyramid of 5 needs, as you can see, and it's split into 5 levels, and of those 5 levels they've really been broken up into 3 broader categories, and all of this is by way of description to try and understand how individuals actually work, how they're motivated. And Maslow proposed that they're motivated by these 5 basic needs, the 5 levels, of which the top 2 are regarded as higher order, the top 2 being self-actualization and esteem needs, as they're rendered in this particular version of the diagram. So let's start at the bottom just to talk about some of the detail. There's this idea that, of course, as individuals we need to feel safe and that we need our basic needs attended to. We need food and water and warmth. And the safety is actually after the need for basic survival, which really makes sense, the idea of food and water. I've heard theorists from other areas say certain things that really lean on this theory, and that is you can't, for example, focus on higher order thinking, things like education and the needs of personal development until you are fed and watered. So if your basic surroundings are problematic for you, if they make life difficult, or you have to focus on those in order to, just get by the day, get through the day, then focusing on education and focusing on, personal gains, personal developments, it becomes much more of a challenge. And so you can imagine, just from general thinking, how organisations are going to need to help individuals feel like they're working on some bigger things than basic survival. Basic survival of the organisation can actually be really problematic for individuals working there. It becomes quite a strain, quite stressful. So we can think of it in those organisational levels too. One, working for the organisation that is struggling becomes a problem, and 2, individuals, if they're felt like they're just there for the basic survival, for their own basic survival, they're often a certain kind of employee that depending on what their needs are, I'm being very general here, but depending on what their needs are, they may not actually feel very invested in the organisation. All right, so we have the basic needs of safety, and then we have these needs of belonging or affiliation, and the necessity of giving and receiving love, for example, which is really important. So when you think about individuals in a company and they think about their purpose, if it's not something bigger than just themselves, it can feel quite hollow, you know. So the idea of love, if you like, I mean, that's a difficult concept to grapple with on some levels. But let's use the language that's in the diagram. The idea of, friendship and relationship coming out in an organization can be important to sustaining it. And then, as we have said already, the two higher order issues. We have esteem. How comfortable am I in that job? How much prestige do I get? What feelings of accomplishment do I achieve from being part of an organization? Organizations strive to do this thing of making people feel connected and like they're accomplished by giving them certain returns. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's a particular goal. I mean, rewards and honours, badges and medals, all of those are about feeling a certain kind of prestige. And these are things that have been artificially created, and some would say, are manipulative in some ways, as a way of getting an individual to feel like they're part of an organisation. However, I think they are quite deeply rooted, and so we shouldn't be so cynical as to say it's just about controlling an individual. So there are needs of esteem where we feel like we're connected, and that can really be brought out in small groups, I think. When you have an organisation and people work in teams and they work to achieve a certain kind of goal, there's a certain kind of confidence and achievement that comes from achieving certain targets, reaching targets, and there being the opportunity to do those things, to excel. Now, self-actualization is this idea of becoming everything that one can be, and I think the route to that will actually vary between people. It may be about achieving autonomy. It may be about being able to exercise responsibility, or creativity can help create this. There's no one way that we can say everyone is going to feel like they're living their best life if we put this in place, because people have different needs. Lastly, with respect to this hierarchy of needs, Maslow proposed a hierarchy of prepotency, which we're going to look at in tutorial. And it's this idea that the lower needs need to be attended to before the higher ones can be reached. And I think in today's organisations it could be argued that with the shift towards the current thinking that is embodied by millennials, there's this greater sense of social consciousness, and it's part of a reflection of the need for wanting to work for the greater good. So the idea that younger people in organisations might seek to do things to elevate a community that they're working in is not just a case of the bottom line because the market supports that. It's because there has been a shift in the thinking, and there's a greater awareness and support for things like ethical business and environmental awareness, for example. And I know I keep citing those two things, and I hope in tutorial you can tell me about the others that you've thought about and know about, because instinctively you understand what I'm talking about when I refer to this. So this is the third and final theory that Catherine Miller references in talking about human relations theory. A couple of things to say about this. This emerged in the late 50s and 60s, so I've put 1960. If you think about it, Maslow's hierarchy was earlier in the 40s and 50s, and the Hawthorne studies were in the 20s and 30s. So essentially what we can say is from the 20s to the 60s, we've had this shift in the way theorists constructed what was going on in organisations and organising. Of course, all of this is to say that, there weren't other things happening, there weren't other pressures, and of course, you know, classical organizations existed, and thinkings about the way, employees should operate within them were of the time, and that was what was happening. So McGregor's theory of X and Y, theory X and theory Y, is this, and they both represent the divergent assumptions of managers vis-a-vis organisational functioning. So let's just be careful about the wording. Theory X manager assumes of human nature the requirement of the worst aspects of classical management theory in order to get a job done. And theory Y assumes of human nature motivation by Maslow's higher order needs. And the next slide breaks it down in a bit more detail, but this is to say a theory X manager thinks that in order to get the job done, we need things like mechanization, standardization, distinct roles, centralized power, and a certain kind of bureaucracy with a certain kind of leadership, maybe top-down hierarchical communication along a vertical chain in order to get things done. That doesn't mean that the Theory X manager is a bad person, because as we've said already, it's been proven that in organisations sometimes incentive is the way to get people to work more productively. In organisation, sometimes it's the management's strong direction which actually achieves certain goals. There are lots of cases in history I think we can think of where unless there was a strong management, things would have just fallen apart. The idea of collaborative thinking and workshopping and all of that is relevant to certain degrees and not in every way. The theory Y manager assumes the motivation by higher order and therefore leans on this idea of people feeling a greater need for relationships, a greater need for having a greater purpose of being loved in an organisation. And I use that in a very general sense of the word, of course, and maybe even achieving these kind of higher order needs with kind of ethical business and that kind of thing. So in this particular slide, we can extract what the human nature of a Theory X person might be like, and the human nature of what a Theory Y person might be like. So if we're looking at the characteristics of an individual, the Theory X person is assumed to have some of these characteristics. And I just want to highlight this notion of preferring to be led, for example, on the left. It's not a bad thing. It means that if you're working in an organisation where you feel you do not have the vision as an individual, obviously you want someone who does have a greater plan to be managing it. It's not that everyone assumes they should be a manager in every given moment. Sometimes they actually want to receive some direction and, be motivated. Theory Y highlights the nature of, what we might assume to be positive things. Things like, I want to highlight this last one, industrialization is minimizing man. And of course, that is posited in a way that cites it as negative. And yet we all know that as a result of industrialization, certain kinds of task-oriented organization that has broken down what is needed is what has put us where we are today. So I just want to be clear that we don't automatically slip into this thinking that X is bad and Y is great in every circumstance and organization. And I want to start with it, or start with our thinking from that point. But then let's talk about what McGregor said, that the X as an average man, works as little as possible, is uninterested in the organisational needs, and is not bright and is easily duped or controlled, maybe by a charlatan, for example. So McGregor believed that this was the wrong way for a manager to work. And the Y person, I guess, was his preferred individual and the Y manager. And he says that the human nature is as natural as play. Punishment is not the only stick, but direction comes about creating motivation. And the average man learns under proper conditions. So the X manager believes in a forceful hand. The Y manager believes it is her job to bring out the natural tendencies and talents of individuals. But as I say, we all know situations whereby people are not motivated by being, collaborative, or being, given some general direction and asked to work on their own steam. It doesn't work in every case and at every level. In every point in time where the theory coalesces around a certain idea, and we can look back and say, oh, this was the kind of moment of human relations theory, and where it kind of rose to prominence and it gained purchase. Of course, there are going to be other ideas bubbling up and moving on and creating a new area of theoretical orientation. And that means that at every given moment in time, there are always going to be a kind of countercurrent and new movement, new expansion. So let's not also get trapped into thinking that theory is a kind of neat box, and that there are distinct demarcations around periods where things are developing, because often there are other ideas that are present. We just don't get to see them because they haven't gained prominence. But what we can say is that human resources theory followed human relations theory, and in some ways elements of the human resources approaches served to critique what had come before. So as we know, human relations, it deals with emotions and feelings of being valued, etc. in the organisation. Human resources really deals with the ideas of innovation and knowledge and ideas that individuals bring. So on this slide, I have said that human resources approaches acknowledge the contributions of the classical approaches to management and the human relations, and then moved it on to these individuals in organisations have feelings that must be considered with respect to their idea of bringing, particular value to an organisation, and that individual labour is an important ingredient for meeting goals. And the focus there is on individual. As a person, you bring a specific perspective, specific knowledge, and maybe you are the tool in a company for leveraging to leverage ideas and bring innovation, for example. So I want to make sure that we're clear that human resources followed human relations, and there was this thinking by the human resources theorists that human relations actually could be misused in some ways by organisational operators, and that's where we're going to start our thinking about human resources. So I created this slide to talk about some of the things that the human relations theory might indicate is useful in organisation, in order to critique them from a human resources perspective, that maybe some of this is driven only by the needs of management and is not really thinking about the human interests of individuals in an organisation. So the first is that the theory Y is actually just a token. This idea that a manager might think individuals need to be considered for their desire to achieve a greater purpose and be buying into something greater is just a token and superficially applied to an organization, more to get control over the labor and not about actually inculcating feelings of being valued or challenged or to achieve self-actualization. We have this idea in organizations that sometimes a plain clothes day actually helps people feel more human. And I've seen it. It works it happens at UE as well. On a Friday, there's a plain clothes day in the Faculty of MedSci, certainly within the Centre for Medical Sciences Education, which is where I was working. And so during the week, Monday to Thursday, people wear their office clothes in quotes, and then on Friday they wear jeans and shirt and t-shirt. And I suppose because of that, meetings aren't held on a Friday, and people just generally they do look more relaxed. But is that really making a significant difference to the way individuals feel? I would I have a question about that. I put a question mark on it. We've also seen, I'm sure in many places, the idea of a suggestion box, the idea that it's actually, the organisation taking your views and opinions and, considering them. I just want to give you an example of my local gym in South. They have a suggestion box, and I've over time written things about the classes and various things about the kind of physical environment of the gym, but I've never actually felt a connection to management in terms of a response. Never received an email, never received a call, never really noticed if that change was happening because of something I said or not, if it indeed did happen. So there's that to think about. At the Faculty of MedSci as well, I've put up this code from page 36 of the faculty booklet. It says that no student will be allowed to enter the skills lab dressed in caps, shorts, jeans, t-shirts, sandals, slippers, sneakers, etc. Students are required to wear white lab coats over acceptable street clothing, in quotes. Now, this actually happens at Faculty of MedSci. All medical students, not students from other disciplines, i.e. pharmacy, nursing, dentistry, but all medical students have to wear black and white throughout the week, and therefore they're not allowed to just be in clothes of other colours. So it's almost like a uniform. And if they are wearing regular clothes, and street is put in quotes, which implies it's something inappropriate or unprofessional, then they have to wear a white lab coat over the top. And we were actually sent very strict rules about not letting in students into skills lab, which was an area I was working in, teaching communication approaches in medical situations, so doctor-patient interaction, things like breaking bad news and counselling and communication theory about how to motivate patients and all of that kind of stuff. I was told that students couldn't come in if they were wearing open-toed slippers, for example. And, again, is this really a good way to inculcate certain, rules and regulations to build professionalism? Or is it just being dogmatic and slightly unnecessary in today's environment? So it's just something for you to think about. But human resources definitely questioned whether some of these things, the plain clothes, the idea of the Y employee and suggestion boxes and that kind of thing, whether it was just used as a way of control and not actually thoroughly thought through and inculcated in the way managers and organisations were thinking. So we're coming towards the end of this lecture, and this is our penultimate slide. And on this slide, I want to talk about a human resources theory called Likert System 1 to 4. And Leichhardt, of course, is the name that you may have come across when doing research methods. He's a theorist from the University of Michigan, and I just want to read something from the Catherine Miller text. She said his work has been influential in a variety of fields, and of course, for the purposes of today, we're going to discuss his work from a book called New Patterns of Management from 1961 and The Human Organisation from 1967. But you may have come across the Likert scale when doing certain kinds of research. And we have the idea of these four systems that balance out management and production, or people and production. So we could actually think about an X and Y axis on a grid, for example, on a graph. And if the X-axis concerns production and Y-axis is concern for the individuals, we could kind of plot a line that indicates different kinds of systems with different balances for these two areas of concern. So I'm going to read from the text a couple of things that relate to each of these systems, and you can see as they go from 1 to 4, there's a greater relevance or support for individuals as you go through the systems, and a lesser control by management as you go from 1 to 4. So system 1, exploitative, authoritative, threats and top-down management. What does Catherine Miller say? She says that they are characterized, these systems, these organizations that are system 1, by threats and fear, downward and inaccurate communication, top-level decision-making. Now, we can think of the worst of organizations, such as sweatshops, I suppose, that in which this operates. I think, strangely, if we're looking for a current example, modern day example, just from my reading of the media information that comes out, it seems like the White House operates in this way. In terms of the communication, it's been written about, certainly from the liberal press, that Donald Trump likes this kind of disorder and chaos, believing that the best comes out of creating that kind of havoc. And I'm not making a political statement there, I'm just recounting some of the things that I've come across in media. System 2 is benevolent authoritative, and in this organisation there is the motivation through economic and ego rewards, limited communication, and there's a top-level control. I had a friend who worked at one of the big 4 financial consultancies in London, and he was one of many employees in a graduate scheme, and I really got the impression from the way he spoke that everyone was very motivated by financial rewards and money and the idea of actually eventually being made partner in an organisation. So the big 4 organisations like KPMG and Pricewaterhouse, Deloitte, and I don't know the other, but I think it's 4 or 5 organisations that are, big financial organisations you can think of. You can imagine stockbrokers, I guess, and people like that, where everything centres around money and, high-level management kind of pushing individuals lower down to reach targets and maximise what they do. System 3 is the consultative organisation. There's a hierarchy with consultation. I have the feeling that the university is a bit like this. There is this very definite classical organisation and structure. There are very definite ways of communicating and reaching out to people, and there is a bid to consult with people and generate the idea of supportive teams and that sort of thing. I think sometimes if I don't know if you share this view, but classical organisations have this problem of trying to encourage the horizontal communication and innovation. They have to work quite hard because the size of the organization means that communication happens in certain ways, and there are structural reasons why the organizations work the way that they do. Then system 4 is called the participative organization, and it's where goals and communication are completely shared. In system 4, decision making is performed by every organizational member, and goals are set by complete work groups. So individual groups set their targets. Well, of course, in a university that doesn't happen. The idea of courses and targets are set by a higher authority that's governing what's actually provided by the university. So, there are reasons why organizations might be a system 2, 3, or 4, or 1. And, 1, of course, is highly undesirable. And you can obviously, by implication from its name, the fact that it's exploitative. 2, 3, and 4 obviously work to varying degrees and suit different kinds of individual and a different kinds of organisation. And so we're not saying they're bad, we're just saying they exist and work in the ways that they do, and that's for us to bear in mind. So here we are at the end of the lecture, and I just want to focus on organisation today and some of the terms that we have for describing the way organising has happened and where we're at with different kinds of thinking within organisations. So we have the concept of learning organisations, where there's an emphasis on flexibility, on team learning, on personal mastery. And we would all, I presume, know of organisations where, people are encouraged to work according to when they can be there. I think the off-site, online processes that we're working with currently may be one of the ways in which organisations are facilitating that flexi time. Personal mastery means that individuals within a company can actually grow with the company and help shape the company's future. I actually found myself in this kind of position in a newsroom where I was working for, again, a magazine, and I was offered one of the higher level management positions, and I turned down a role as assistant editor. I wanted my colleague to be the editor. I felt he had a better vision for the particular magazine I was working for. I was offered assistant and I didn't want it. I actually wanted to be features editor, which meant I would spend time growing as the best possible writer within the organisation. That's where I felt my skills were, and that's what I wanted to do. It didn't mean I wanted less pay. It wasn't that it was about the money, it was about the role. The assistant editor is very much involved in the construction of a magazine and working of a newsroom, commissioning articles, editing, and that kind of thing, and I didn't want that role. Then we have the idea of knowledge management, the cycle of knowledge development and application, so people learn from their mistakes. And whereas classical organisations are concerned with protocols and shifting protocols, knowledge management really focuses on how individuals can change an organisation, and is probably less focused on protocols and more on the organic learning that comes up through the organisation. Of course, we have human resources involved in the organisations of today that we think of as being well structured and well managed, and the employee involvement that is generated by human resources says that individuals within a company from all levels need to have a say, or should have a say if we want a good organisation. So, when I worked in telesales, we were scripted, everything was very scientific. There was this kind of scientific management approach, so little attention was placed on my role or my voice or making the script my own. I just had to follow a script to the letter, pretty much, and see if I could prompt a sale. And the thinking was that that would work. I did not do well in that environment. It wasn't for me. And, I would question why us as individuals who were working in customer service essentially weren't involved in the process. So we can think about employee involvement in that way. And of course, team management, which I skipped over, is just this idea that teams become, functioning units within an organization. We have that, and we can see that a lot in organization. And that is because, managing a team and understanding the resources that the team needs and the goals that the team can achieve are thought to be better on a kind of micro level rather than this macro level. So rather than a manager who is some steps away from understanding the particular needs of an organisation, better to have someone who's more hands-on and closer to the group and better understands their needs. And we know of small groups within organisations at so many different levels. So let's just end with some points of some ideas around organisation and things that we need to be mindful of. One is when we have team-based management, it will work in certain circumstances and not in others. So we need to be mindful of when to apply the small team and when to apply, something that's more top-down, because that's going to be relevant. So point 2 is change often still rests with the top. So, it's from the top that we get our attitudes towards the organisation, towards the vision, towards the direction, and that is going to be completely important and essential to the way an organisation works. 3, employee cynicism needs to be addressed. It can happen that top-down management has a directive or has a direction, and people just don't buy into it. So in order for an organisation, I think, to be effective today, we need to see change from the employee perspective and get some buy-in, and that can be achieved in many different ways, and I'm sure you can think of communication strategies for doing that kind of thing. And lastly, that when organisations are going through change, transition needs to be a managed process. I don't think it's possible to just set up rules and leave them to pan out. In so many different ways, we can imagine ways in which just creating a rule and leaving it isn't going to function well. Both from our experiences of outside organisation, I'm thinking of rules of the road, where we don't have good enforcement. Often people just don't follow those rules for various reasons. And we have this example from the groupthink lecture with the situation in Florida, where management in that case actually had very bad protocols, but even with the protocols there was no follow-up and no processes that were built into the idea of keeping these things going along and being followed for good reason and monitoring. So this brings us to the end of today's lecture. And with that, I wish to thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in tutorial. Many thanks.